In this position, black plays the very tricky move b3, which sacrifices a pawn on a4. And after the rook takes a4, which is the trap set by black, black finds the move b2, bishop to d4 check. But black sacrifices the rook! Rook takes d4. And after white plays rook takes d4, we promote to a queen on the b1 square. And black is completely winning. Welcome to a new episode of How to Reach 2000. Today we'll be looking at a game in which the average rating of the players is 650. Some of you might be stuck at this rating, and here are some simple tips you can use to improve your chess. White starts with the move e4, which is the most common move across all levels in chess. e4 allows quick development of this bishop and the knight, which allows the king to castle kingside and be safe on g1. Black responds with the move d5, which is called the Scandinavian defense, and it threatens to take the pawn on e4. And if white takes the pawn on d5, the queen will take the pawn on d5. The drawback of playing this opening with the black pieces is the queen is centralized very early in the game, and white has developing moves that attack the queen. It's not very good for beginners to play this opening because white can quickly develop their pieces and castle kingside. In this game, we don't get the main line, which is e takes d5, but we get the second most popular move, which is knight c3. Knight c3 allows d4. d4 is the best move for black because once they play d4, the knight gets kicked back and then they can play c5. Black has a solid center and black doesn't really have problems. They can quickly play e5, knight c6, bring the other knight out, and then develop the bishops, and they have a very comfortable position. White, on the other hand, has no space because of this pawn on d4, which controls these squares. This knight over here is very clumsy. It blocks the bishop on f1. It's not very pleasant to play this position with white. It's not over yet. White still has the option to go knight to g3 and knight f3, bring this bishop out, and then play a move like d3, and then have a solid position. In the game, we get d takes e4, which is the most common move in this position, and white recaptures the pawn with the knight. Now the position is about equal. White has this knight in the center. It could be a target with this or the bishop going to the f5 square. But if the bishop goes to the f5 square, then white has this move knight g3, which gets tempo on the light squared bishop, and the bishop has to go back. Moves like f5 are not very good because they weaken the king side. f5 opens up this diagonal, and it's not very good for the black pieces because of this open queen. It's not a problem yet to play f5, but in the future it creates too many weaknesses for black to deal with. Black plays the move knight f6, which is an okay move. If white takes the knight on f6, then black can recapture with the e pawn or the g pawn, which opens up the e or the g file for this rook to become active. E takes also opens up this bishop for quicker development, and I would generally recommend taking like this. Also, G takes creates too many pawn islands. So in the endgame, you want the minimum number of pawn islands so that your pawns are all connected and they work together. In this case, we have 2 pawn islands. They're all connected. But if black decides to take with the G pawn, now there are 3 pawn islands. The F pawns are doubled and the H pawn is an isolated pawn. This H pawn is an isolated pawn because it has no neighbors. It doesn't have a G pawn that can potentially support the H pawn when it's pushed. This is obviously a huge weakness. White can put pressure on this pawn in the future or in the endgame once the pieces are traded, and it's not a very good endgame for black. But if you choose to take with the G pawn, the good thing about it is you can play rook g8, and if white ever castles kingside after moving the bishop and the knight, the king and the rook would be lined up. It can set up potential attacks on the king side. And also you can throw this h pawn down the board and go all the way to h3 and create a weakness on the h2 square. In the game, we get knight takes knight, which is not a good move by black because that removes the pawn from the f3 square and moves it to the e4 square. So after the recapture, white has these 2 pawns in the center. Having the 2 central pawns versus 1 central pawn is beneficial for white because if the pawn goes to d4, then white is controlling a lot of space in the center, which means that the black pieces cannot be active. The black pieces will be dominated by the 2 central pawns that white has, and they cannot develop to natural squares very easily. In the game, we get e5, which is a very good move because it controls the d4 square and it prevents the pawn move to the d4 square. White plays the move d3, which blocks in the bishop, but it defends the e4 pawn. Defending the e4 pawn or covering this check is very important in the white position because of this open diagonal. Let's say white does a move like c3. This would be a blunder because of queen h4 check, and now g3 is no longer possible because of queen takes e4, and then the rook and the king would be attacked at the same time and black would be winning a rook. The other line is to go up with your king, and after queen takes e4, this is not a pleasant position for white because the king is in the center of the board and the queen is very angry and it's very active in the center of the board. The king over here also blocks in this queen and the bishop. It's not very good for the white pieces because of the lack of activity, and black is also up a pawn. d3 is a passive move because it blocks in the bishop. Personally, I would have played a move like knight f3, which covers the check. Black plays the move knight c6, which develops the knight into the center of the board. And also there can be potential ideas of playing knight d4. White plays the move c3, which restricts this knight from going forwards. This can be a good move, but in this case this is kind of a waste of time. White should focus on developing the pieces to natural squares and getting their king castled as soon as possible. And also white hasn't played knight f3 yet, so queen h4 is still an option for the black pieces. Black plays the move bishop to c5, which is an excellent move because it controls this diagonal and the bishop is developed to an excellent square where it controls some space around the king. This square on f2 is very important to control because it could lead to some potential ideas of checkmate. Like let's say white plays the move g4, which would be a really bad move. There could be this, and it could go wrong really quickly. So obviously white doesn't have to get checkmated and he can just play a move like knight f3, which would be the best move because it prevents queen h4 right now and also it prevents queen h4 in the future. White correctly plays the move knight to f3, which prevents queen h4 check, and also it puts pressure on the e5 pawn. Here black plays a move that doesn't really make any sense. The bishop is very well placed, but then they move it back to d6 to defend this pawn, which was already defended. The line with the knight sacrifice on e5 doesn't work because of this following line. After knight takes e5, there's knight takes e5, and temporarily black is up a piece. But then there's this move d4, which attacks the bishop and the knight at the same time. So if one of these pieces will move, then the other piece will be captured. So white will regain the piece. But in this case, there is a line which is winning for the black pieces. Let's turn on the eval and see why it is so bad. The move is queen to h4, and now we can see that the pawn moved from d3 to d4 unstabilized the center. So the pawn on e4 is no longer defended by the pawn on d3, so this pawn is undefended. And if the king goes up, obviously we have takes and it's a check and we're gonna win a pawn, and also the white king is no longer safe. And if the king goes here, we can still take the pawn, and they cannot take any of our pieces because of the rook move. Now this is gonna lead to checkmate by king e1, then queen takes d1 is checkmate. After knight f3, there was no reason for black to be scared of this move, and they decided to be safe and overprotect the pawn on e5 and prevent any of the ideas of playing knight takes. Here, white plays an excellent move, which is pawn to d4. Pawn to d4 puts two pawns in the center, and if black takes, then white recaptures with the pawn, and they have two pawns in the center which are dominating the knight and the bishop. Also, the pawn over here prevents a move like bishop e6 because it would be followed by the move d5, which wins a piece. Black takes and relinquishes the control of the center, so it was not a good move. Knight takes simply hangs a piece to queen takes d4 or knight takes d4. It's important to note that after queen takes d4, the knight still defends the queen. Let's say the knight doesn't defend, then there is this x-ray vision between the two queens, and the bishop could move to the g3 square, and it would be a check. So after the pawn takes the bishop, there was this, and white loses the queen. But in this case, the knight defends the queen, so there is no idea of playing the check and then taking the queen, because that would simply hang a piece and you're not winning the queen. In this position, black plays an awful move, which is bishop to f4, which just hangs the bishop in one move. It was a decent game in the opening, but the middle game is just awful. Queen takes d8 is probably the simplest of all options, because you simply trade the queens, and also you can recapture the bishop afterwards, and you're simply going to be up two pieces. In the game we get bishop takes f4, and after they trade the queens, which is also an awful move. You should not be trading queens when you're down material. Maybe a move like this was better, but this is still losing because black is just losing everything. It's very important to make a plan. White's plan is to develop all the pieces, maybe grab a pawn, and get castled as soon as possible so that you can bring a rook to the e-file and defend the pawn. Black, on the other hand, should castle kingside and bring the rook to the e-file and try to take the pawn on e4, which forks the knight and the bishop. But in this position, black plays the move g6, which doesn't really do anything. It just passes the move back to the white pieces. White plays a really good move, which is bishop to b5 check. Bishop to b5 sets up the trap of c6, and then knight takes c6. And after the pawn takes c6, there's a fork. c6, knight takes c6. After pawn takes c6, we have bishop takes c6. And after the king moves away, we take the rook in the corner of the board. Now we have an extra rook, an extra bishop, and we have an extra pawn. So that's a completely winning advantage. Unfortunately, white doesn't find the move knight to c6, and they simply attack the rook, which is of higher value than this bishop. This is called danger levels, and if the rook moves, then they can save the bishop, and if the bishop gets captured, then they take the rook, which is of the higher value. In this position, black decides to play the move pawn takes b5, which is not a good move because it hangs the rook in the corner of the board. And in the game, we get f5, which is not a good move because it allows takes and then takes. And after knight takes b5, we're threatening another fork, which could win more material. In this game, white plays castles. There are many good moves in this position. e5 is one of the good moves, and a sample line would be like e5, and e5 creates a pass pawn, which is 3 squares away from promotion. Also, you can try to create a box around the king and try to checkmate the black pieces. Bishop d7, it's just a sample line. Let's say after this, create this formation, and in this case the king cannot go anywhere, and if we can somehow bring the rook to the 7th rank and go to the other side, we can win this game. So let's say rook moves maybe this, just to show you guys the plan. After this, there is nothing much that they can do. So this is how you create mating nets. You try to think of a plan and see what you would do if you get like a few consecutive moves. Obviously, black is going to do something about it, but you have to try to make a plan. In the game, we get castles and then pawn takes e4. And after that, white plays the move rook to e1, attacking this pawn. Black doesn't defend the pawn, so white just simply takes the pawn. Black attacks the bishop. White gives a check to prevent the bishop from getting captured. And after this move, the rook is under attack. So the rook has to be protected either by the other rook swinging to the e-file, or you can just simply move the rook away to maybe some of these squares. In the game, we get rook f1 check, which is a big mistake because the rook on e8 is simply hanging. After white hangs the rook, white proceeds to play the move knight to e6, which hangs a knight, and black can simply take the knight on e6. The reason why this evaluation is slightly better is because black has something called a pawn majority on the queen side. Black has 3 pawns versus 2 pawns. And also we can note that this is an opposite colored bishop endgame, and opposite colored bishop endgames tend to be draws in most cases, but in this case it's not going to be a draw because there's still a rook on the board. If the rook was traded for the other rook, then the chances for draws are a lot higher. In this position, black pieces have the pawn majority. They have to start pushing the pawns and create a passed pawn on the queen side. So let's see how good the endgame technique of the black pieces is. Black defends the bishop because it was attacked, and then white brings the bishop to a central square. After the move rook to d8, we can notice that the king and the rook are lined up on the dark squares. I would say the best move for white is to play the move bishop to f4. At first this looks like it doesn't really do anything, but it pins this bishop so that black can no longer take the pawn on a2, and also it threatens this move bishop to g5. Bishop to g5 wins an exchange, and on top of that you're going to take the bishop. So if black does nothing, you're threatening to play bishop to g5, and after the king moves away, you can take the rook, and after the king takes the bishop, you take the free bishop, and you're completely winning because you're up a rook for 1 pawn. In the game, white plays the move rook to f1, which also threatens this move, and black responds with the move rook to d5, which gets out of this alignment issue, so bishop f6 is no longer winning an exchange. Now, white plays the move bishop f6 anyways, and black goes wrong by playing king to f7. King to f7 means that this rook has x-ray vision on the king, and any bishop move would result in a check. And we can notice that the only pawn on the dark square is the a7 pawn, and we can play bishop to d4, which wins this pawn. Now, black will no longer have the pawn advantage, and these pawns are double pawns, so it would be really hard for black to win this game. So the best move is arguably to play the move bishop to d4, which is a check, so black doesn't have the time to take the free bishop. He has to move the king out of the way, maybe over here, and then you can pick up this pawn. As you can see, now the position is slightly more equal. It's only like a slight advantage for the black pieces. And this number doesn't really matter at this elo. It's a very small advantage. Now, a move like rook to d2 would be activating the rook, and then you're also activating the bishop, and you're gonna win one of these pawns. Unfortunately, white doesn't find the move bishop to d4, which wins a pawn. Instead, he goes for the move bishop to g5. Bishop to g5 controls the d2 square, so rook d2 is not a problem. Also, it checks the king, so black cannot just take the free bishop. Offering a rook trade on the f5 square is not ideal for the black pieces. Like I said earlier in the video, trading a pair of rooks is not beneficial for the black pieces. It makes the game a lot more drawish. This is not much of an advantage. White can play the move a3, and we can notice that the pawns are on dark squares, whereas white has a light squared bishop, so the light squared bishop can never take these pawns. Now, it's a lot harder to break through with the one pawn majority on the queen side. In the game, after the king hides on the g7 square, we have bishop to e3. Bishop to e3 has eyes on this square. Also, the bishop on this diagonal is covering the d2 square, so rook d2 is not a move. Black plays the move a5, which is an excellent move because it pushes the pawns on the queen side where black has a majority, and eventually he's going to try to make a pass pawn on the queen side. A pass pawn is a pawn that cannot be stopped by pawns in front of it. After a5, we get b3. a4 is played anyways, so takes. h3 is a bad move because it wastes some time, and also it puts more pawns on the light squares. Putting the pawns on light squares is not good for the white pieces. Now, black plays the excellent move b5. b5 pushes the pawn so that you can go to the b4 square and then to the b3 square. And then if a takes b3, you play a takes b3, and now you have a pass pawn on the b file. Bishop here is a move that doesn't really have a purpose, it's just wasting time, and now black correctly plays the move b4, which threatens to make a pass pawn in the next move. In this position, the two pawns are skewered by the rook, so if one of the pawns will move, then the other pawn can be captured. But in reality, that's actually not the case, because there's a brilliant way to win the game. Black plays this move b3, which is a very tricky move. b3 sets up the trap of rook takes a4, and after rook takes a4, you're completely winning because you fake the threat of taking the a2 pawn, but then you sneak the pawn to the b2 square, and it's actually impossible to stop this pawn from promoting, or impossible to keep your material. You're gonna lose some material in this case. The best move is rook to b4, and after rook to b4, black has rook check on d1, and after the king moves either f2 or h2, black can simply promote to a queen, and white is forced to give up the rook for the promoted pawn. In the game, white plays this move bishop to d4 check, which seems like it forks the king and the pawn, and it does. So if the king just moves, as you can see, the eval is just equal because they can just take the pawn. And now white is the one trying to win this game because he's up a pawn, and he can start pushing this outside pass pawn. But in this position, after bishop check, there's the brilliant rook sacrifice. He sacrifices the rook. Rook takes d4. And after rook takes d4, promote to queen, which is winning. King f2, and then queen b2, which is a fork of the rook and the king. In this position, they had to defend the rook. But unfortunately, white didn't find the move, and they played king to g3, which allows queen takes rook. After king g3, black plays this really good move, which is g5. It sets up some mating ideas. The king goes here, queen to f2, and then checkmate them the next move, with queen takes g2. And if the pawn pushes, then there's queen takes h4, which is checkmate in 1. Black does find g5, but he doesn't find the proper follow-up after this. He doesn't find the mate in 1. He plays g takes h4, which is not the best move because they missed mate in 1, and after this they played king h3. In this position there's mate in 2 with the move queen to f4, so this allows the king from moving. The king is basically stalemated, but they can move the pawns, and after any of the pawn moves, queen to g3 checkmate, bishop to g2, which is not a good move, but that's what they play. And after this, they find queen to f2, which is one of the best moves. This threatens to move the bishop and then checkmate white. After this move, there's mate in 2, bishop f3, and the king is forced to h3. Now there's the mate in 1 with queen to g3. Black doesn't find that, he goes for h3, pushing the pass pawn, a4, queen to f4 check, king g1, black pushes the pawn. After this, queen to h4, a5, promote to a queen, and this is checkmate. Thank you very much for watching till the end. Feel free to suggest ideas for future videos. Enjoy the rest of your day.